So today's lesson, we are looking at market failure. So this is to start off our investigation into the role of the government in our economy. And one of the key things that we've been learning about recently, over the course of the last few terms, is the fact that we model a lot of our theories on a perfectly competitive market. However, we know that perfectly competitive markets rarely exist, and as such, that at times there are what we consider market failures, where a failure to either provide a good or to not provide a good, or some other reason why this perfectly competitive market doesn't operate as it should. And in those instances in our society, or in our economy, the government may choose to step in some of these areas. So the things we want to understand from this part of the syllabus is we want to understand first and foremost that the perfect market is not perfect, that it's very rare, and that it doesn't always provide what our society needs or wants. We want to understand that the market fails to provide all goods required for society. We want to know that sometimes the market might provide goods we don't want, like alcohol or drugs or things like that, tobacco. Government intervention can improve the operation of the market, but government intervention should be limited. These are the key terms that you need to know as we progress through this video. I would suggest, if you aren't aware of any of these terms, that you go through the textbook and define each of these terms and try and get a working understanding of each of them. Things like market failure, non-excludable goods, so on and so forth, we haven't covered yet, and it would be a good idea to get onto those as soon as possible. So, market failure comes in a number of forms. The four main forms we're going to be looking at are the provision of goods and services, so why the market fails to provide some goods or may provide other goods that we don't necessarily want. How the market can sometimes fail in an equal distribution of income. We look at positive and negative externalities, and we look at the abuse of market power as a failure of the market. Fifth thing we look at is the business cycle, and we look at how the government can at times step in to smooth out fluctuations in the business cycle. So let's have a look at the first one, and we're looking here at the failure of market in the provision of goods and services. The first thing that we want to understand is the fact that in an economy, sometimes public goods, so those goods that are of public interest, that the entire public can use, some things would not be provided if it were left up to the forces of supply and demand. So we're thinking of things like parks, like the Defence Force, or like lifeguards that may not be provided if they were left to the forces of supply and demand. Now, for it to be a public good, that needs to be non-excludable, so we can't stop people from using the good or service, such as lifeguards, or such as a park, or such as the Defence Force. You can't choose whether or not you want it. It is for everyone. And it has to be non-rival. So that is, one person's use of the good or service cannot diminish the use of that good or service by another. So in all of these instances, these examples here, we've got a park where it is both non-excludable and non-rival, and perhaps parks, if it was user pay, some people would demand parks, others wouldn't, and it would effectively be too costly in order to provide those. So the government steps in and provides those parks. The same with the Defence Force. If we had a choice, some people perhaps would not choose a Defence Force. We also don't want to leave that in the hands of the private system. So we don't want a private army looking after our economy. And the same with lifeguards, a very good example of something that is non-excludable and non-rival, and also something where certain councils bear the cost of providing that for all of society. So for example, the Bondi lifeguards are paid by Waverley Council. The citizens of Waverley pay for their services. However, anybody can visit the beach down there and utilise that service. So we have these other things called merit goods. So merit goods are a type of public good. Things like doctors or things like education. These are things that are good for society, that the government can provide. So a healthcare system, for example, or an education system, in order to provide benefits for society. If the government did not provide these, then perhaps we wouldn't have the system that we would have today, and it wouldn't be provided if it was user pay. Some people would be able to afford an education, others perhaps would not, and that would be to the detriment of society. Demerit goods are, on the other hand, are things that might be provided that necessarily we don't want in society, and this is a failure of the market. So, for example, tobacco are not generally not a very good thing for society, nor alcohol or poker machines. All of these are provided within our market because they're demanded. There is a demand for them. However, some would argue that they provide negative consequences for society, and this is a market failure. So the government, as a response, will step in and they will regulate this system. So, for example, they put limits on the age at which you can play pokies or purchase cigarettes or drink alcohol. They also tax very heavily in order to restrict demand of these goods and services. So, for example, by taxing cigarettes at such a high rate of tax, that limits demand or provides an incentive for smokers to reduce their demand on cigarettes. The same with alcohol, and a good example of that was the Alcopops tax, which came out a few years ago in order to address issues surrounding underage drinking. The next one we're going to look at, the next failure, is issue with in terms of the provision of goods and services, or a way in which the government steps in, are what we call natural monopolies. So sometimes the government, in order to ensure a good or service is provided for society, they will create a natural monopoly. So we're thinking here things like our Sydney water system. We have one company who dominates that market, Sydney Water. They are the only company that provides water to our houses, to the taps in Sydney. They've been provided that natural monopoly by the government. Our electricity lines are the same. So we have Energy Australia, or Ausgrid, who maintain our energy lines, and the rail system is another example. Now, without government intervention in the market, if it was totally user pay, the cost of establishing these services would be so great that private companies may not necessarily provide these services for society. So this is an instance where, in order to ensure we have these necessary or essential services within society, the government steps in. Another way in which we see market failure is in the distribution of income. We know that free markets, so when left to supply and demand, they tend to provide substantial income inequality. And so one way in which the government steps in order to address this issue is to provide an education. So when we provide the education system for society, we know that by educating students and educating our youth, that we can break the poverty cycle. With that, if it was user pay education, that would be much more difficult, and that inequality would grow as less and less go through our education system. So one way in which the government intervene in order to seek out a more even distribution of income is education. So we know that an unequal distribution of income is generally acceptable in society, but to the degree at which a free market would allow it to happen is not what we want. Welfare is another way in which we ensure that income is distributed more evenly. So welfare are payments that are received by those who either can't contribute to the workforce, or for whatever reason, whether they're disabled or so on, or for other reasons, so for new parents, for students, so on and so forth, or the unemployed, to try and get them back into the workforce. So the effect of welfare is that we provide a payment to those who need it that allows them to get back on their feet and try and minimise the damage of having no income. If left to a free market society, we wouldn't have welfare. So this is one way in which we try and minimise unequal distribution of income. The third way in which we deal with this is a progressive tax system in Australia. So the more you earn, as you earn, you push into higher tax brackets and pay more tax. So we tax the highest earners the most and the lowest earners the least. And we also have a very decent amount at which you can earn before you have to pay any tax. So our tax-free threshold is around about $18,000. So until you earn $18,000 or whatever the number is, you don't actually pay any tax. So this is another way in which we distribute, or we try and distribute income a little bit more equal in society. The next thing we're going to look at are externalities. So externalities are goods or services that are produced that provide either a benefit or a cost to society that isn't factored into the price of the good or service itself. So we have positive externalities. Positive externalities provide some sort of social benefit to society, some added benefit that when we provide the good or service, the rest of society or some other people in society will see some benefit from that. And this is not necessarily factored into the price of the good itself. So for example, vaccinations. So we know that when we vaccinate our children or when we vaccinate against certain diseases, that the rest of society actually benefit from this. And they benefit because we have less spread of disease, making our society much more healthy. There have also been studies looking into vaccinations that also look at the fact that those who, when we have high rates of vaccinations in societies, economies tend to save more funds. A little bit random, I know. The other is education. So the price of education doesn't necessarily factor in the external benefits that come, or the social benefits that come with having an educated society. And generally we look at this in the way of productivity. So when we increase our productivity of society, we generally have a much better functioning economy with lower unemployment, so on and so forth. This is a positive benefit on the economy that is not necessarily factored into the price of the good or service itself. On the other hand, we have negative externalities. So negative externalities are when there is some form of social cost that when a good or service is produced, that cost is not included or factored into the price of the good or service itself. So plenty of examples here, but when factories produce goods and services, maybe it's a coal mine or any other sort of factory, we utilize electricity, which creates carbon emissions. That reduces air quality for the entirety of society. So whether or not I am purchasing goods or services from a certain factory, the entirety of society will have to bear the social cost of environmental pollution. Another good example are the effects of smoking on in terms of secondhand smoke. So when we produce cigarettes for society as a good, we actually bear the social cost of having secondhand smoke in society as well. So that's a better benefit. So if I'm walking past someone who's smoking and I breathe in that smoke, I haven't paid to have that poor air quality. So it's a very difficult thing for governments to step in on. One way in which the government has attempted to do that is by taxing cigarettes more or regulating the system as well. So putting in place rules or laws that don't allow for smoking in certain areas, so at restaurants or in certain public areas. In terms of the pollution, the government has attempted to regulate these systems or even implement taxes like the Mineral Resources Rent Tax, which you may know as our carbon tax, which didn't really work, unfortunately. So it's an ongoing issue for governments in order to deal with air pollution. The next area we're going to look at is abuse of market power, and I'll try and do this one really quickly. So we've got four main areas of abuse of market power. We're going to look at monopolisation, price discrimination, exclusive dealing, and then collusion and market sharing. So we know a monopoly is when there is one firm that has the dominant market share. So a monopoly will have one firm that produces all of that good for society. There are very few monopolies out there. However, there are plenty of oligopolies. So when we look at oligopolies, we're going to have a couple of or a few big firms. So if you think about the supermarket industry, we have Woolworths, we have Coles, we have Aldi, so on and so forth. They're operating in an oligopoly situation. When we have monopolies or oligopolies, the issue here is that they are able to control market share in the market and therefore adjust the price accordingly. So if a monopoly wants to drive out any possible competition in the market, they might choose to use their market share in order to drive down prices. So they might lower prices straight away and try and wipe out the competition. And this has been an issue in the past when we look at things like news agencies or corner stores being pushed out of the market by extremely low prices. On the flip side, if there is no competition for the monopoly, they may choose to raise prices, or what we call price skim, so have really high prices, particularly when they sell goods that are price inelastic. In terms of oligopolies, they can do the same. Sometimes they can get into price wars, which, if you think about the supermarket, Coles and Woolworths price wars, they lowered prices of milk, for example, to compete with each other, but in doing so also had a detrimental effect on corner stores, so that they're smaller competitors. Price discrimination is somewhat common in society. It's when we charge a different price to different consumers for the same good. So, for example, airline tickets off one area in which we see price discrimination. Now, price discrimination is illegal. It is prohibited under the Competition and Consumer Act of 2010. However, only when it substantially reduces competition. In the instance of airline tickets, where it is allowed, the way in which they price discriminate is by offering different prices at different times. So the earlier you book, the cheaper it is. That's price discrimination because they're charging more to business customers who tend to book very, very late. So they tend to book a few days or a couple of weeks before the trip because their plans are uncertain. Whereas if you're a holiday maker, you can get cheaper prices relatively early. Exclusive dealing is when a company, a business, a firm will choose or if when establishing a relationship with a customer, will say, I'm going to supply this good to you, but you can't use any of our competitors' goods. So this used to be reasonably common in certain industries. So for example, if you were a pub and you had sold Coca-Cola in your pub, you would not be allowed to sell Pepsi, for example. And this is still the case in certain places, but it is prohibited under the Competition and Consumer Act. So I'd be interested to see how businesses like Coca-Cola get around it. It used to be common in the alcohol industry as well. So you would go to one pub and they would only sell Carlton and United Breweries beers, things like Carlton Draft or so on and so forth. And then the next pub would only sell their competitors' beers. And that was because of exclusive dealing. It is now prohibited under the Competition and Consumer Act. And the last one is collusion and market sharing. So if we're in a oligopoly situation where there are a couple of big firms, sometimes they may get together and collude on price. So they'll sit down and they'll work out a price that they think is fair between the two of them, and they won't compete. So this is clearly anti-competitive and has a detrimental effect on consumers because consumers end up paying the higher price. So collusion or market sharing is prohibited, again, under the Competition and Consumer Act. The last area we needed to talk about was the business cycle. So we know the business cycle is this graph that we've got on the screen to the right, and that's GDP over time. And generally, if left up to free market conditions, we will generally see relatively large fluctuations between upswings and downswings, booms and recessions. Now we know when there's an upswing, that means GDP growth is increasing, which means spending is increasing, which means that's going to increase inflation. It's going to lower unemployment, which is good, but that lower unemployment will get to a point in time where we get wage push inflation, so inflation will continue to occur. And if inflation gets above that 2 to 3% band, then we may very well see a crash in GDP growth. So we don't want big fluctuations in our cycle. Now we have two main macroeconomic stabilizers. So this is the two main ways in which the Australian government will address or try and minimize the fluctuations in the business cycle. And that's monetary policy, as we've been looking at over the last couple of weeks. So those decisions by the Reserve Bank of Australia in order to adjust interest rates in the economy. And the second is fiscal policy. So that's the government's spending and taxation decisions that they make. So if we are in an upswing and we're seeing unsustainable GDP growth, so we're worried about perhaps it crashing, then perhaps the government could tax more, for example, or spend less. Taxing more takes a lot longer to implement. So generally, we operate this stabilizer through spending decisions, so either spending more or spending less. We also have what we call automatic stabilizers in our system. So these are two factors that are built into our economic system that the government have put there but don't necessarily need to implement themselves at times. So these two factors operate independently on their own and will do so automatically in order to minimize the fluctuations in the business cycle. And that is our progressive tax system and our welfare system. So what I'll do is I'll draw a graph for you and we'll try and play this one out. So if we're looking at our graph here, we're going to draw up a graph of GDP over time. So this is GDP growth. That'll be percentage growth, and that's time. And we're just going to put an upswing and a downswing, upswing, downswing. All right, so this is our downswing, and we're going to play this out. So during a downswing, we're going to see declining GDP growth, which is going to see a decrease in spending, which means increased unemployment, and decreasing inflation. All right, so this level of unemployment, as this increases unemployment, this means less people are working. So the effect on taxation here, if we look at taxation, receipts, so that's the level of taxation received by the government, will actually decline. However, in order to reduce the effect of this increase in unemployment, we have this idea of welfare. So when we're getting more people unemployed, more people will then be receiving welfare receipts. And this is the key one to think about with the downswing. So because more people are receiving welfare receipts, that'll minimize the effect of this downswing. So rather than spending nothing because I'm unemployed, I may actually still receive some form of an income. It won't be a lot, but that level of income will allow me to spend in the economy. And that might just be on rent or food or so on. But whatever it is for, it is spending that is occurring thanks to this welfare. So the fact that this actually slows down the decline in spending means that this will bottom out a little bit earlier than it would have otherwise. So you'll see that because of this, it's bottomed out a little bit earlier, which has flattened out that business cycle. If we just select all of this, no, we'll delete that, delete delete that. So let's have a look at what happens in an upswing. So this is our upswing. We get increasing GDP growth. We get declining unemployment, so more people have jobs. This results in increasing in spending. This results in increased inflation. All right, this spending is the key here. So if we get this too high, then we risk a crash. So when we get increased spending, what also happens and decreasing unemployment, if we get down below that NAIRU in particular, we actually start poaching staff. So if we start poaching, we get an increase in wages. So wage growth will increase as well. All right, and what happens here is that 1, we have less welfare payments, but 2, we also get more taxation because of bracket creep. So if I'm on the 3rd highest taxation bracket and maybe my income goes up because of wage growth, I start to creep brackets. So I move up into a new pay bracket, for example. So then I end up paying a larger proportion of my pay in taxation. So this can actually have this limiting effect here to sort of smooth out that part of the business cycle as well. If that doesn't make sense, then we're going to go through it in class and we're actually going to look at this in a little bit more detail as we progress forward. But I think that's about it in terms of this part of the syllabus. Hope that helped.